part 2 of Hamlet, story originally written by Shakespeare, but this is a retelling by Pamela Butchart. Now I'll give you a brief synopsis. That's a summary of what happened so far, what we heard about last week. If you remember, Zach couldn't make his mind up. He couldn't decide on what he wanted and whether to pick the car when they were playing Monopoly or whether he was going to have the hat. And Maisie says it's just like the story of Hamlet, because Hamlet couldn't make up his mind. If you remember, Hamlet's father had been killed by Claudius. And Claudius was then going to marry Hamlet's mother, and Hamlet's father's ghost came back to tell Hamlet this, and he wanted Hamlet to avenge his father's death. And so Hamlet was given the predicament really of being told that really he had to kill Claudius. But Hamlet wanted to be sure, first of all, that Claudius had killed his father before he then avenged this. And so he puts on this play where the murder happens as he's been told it has, which was basically that Claudius had poured poison into Hamlet's dad's ear. And at this point in the play, Claudius goes as white as a sheet and he shouts, "This is the worst play I have ever seen." And that's when Hamlet realised the truth about the fact that Claudius had killed his brother. Everything got a bit out of hand after that. Hamlet's mum started screaming and crying, even though she had no idea what was going on and she was just being super dramatic. So Hamlet told her to go to her room and that he'd meet her there in a minute because he had to go to the toilet first. But Hamlet didn't go to the toilet because he didn't need to go, and he'd only pretended that he needed to go because he was on his way to kill Claudius and avenge his father's death. Hamlet found Claudius praying with his eyes closed, so he raised his dagger in the air. But then he changed his mind. He didn't really want to kill anyone while they were saying their prayers, but he did want to avenge his dad. And then he thought maybe he actually did need a wee. So he ran to the bathroom, but then stopped halfway and cried, "To wee or not to wee? That is the question," because he wasn't sure. Hamlet talked to himself for half an hour until he'd forgotten what he was doing there, and then he went to see his mum for a cuddle because his brain was hurting. But Gertrude wouldn't give him a cuddle because he tried to tell her what Claudius was really like, and she didn't like hearing that, so she kept covering her ears and saying, "La la la la, I am not listening to you, la 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 la." And when Hamlet tried to take her hands off her ears, she screamed the whole palace down because she was probably the most dramatic person that had ever lived. Then Hamlet noticed something behind one of the curtains, and he thought it was Claudius spying on him, so he took his dagger and stuck it right through the curtain. But it wasn't Claudius, it was Polonius, Claudius's best friend and Ophelia's dad, who had been spying, and now he was dead. But to be fair, that had been a pretty stupid place to stand, so it really wasn't all Hamlet's fault. That's when Hamlet's mum looked a bit sad for Hamlet, and it was probably because Hamlet just couldn't do anything right. I mean, finally he'd made a decision and Curtin stabbed someone, and it wasn't even the right person. Hamlet tried to get out of it by saying that he thought he'd heard a rat and they'd been trying to stab that, but nobody believed him, so he left the castle for a bit. But then he found out that Ophelia had been so upset about her dad that she'd run away and tripped and fallen into a river. And died. And he got so upset that he just began wandering around graveyards with Horatio because he was getting a bit obsessed with killing and dead people and worms. And it didn't help him when he saw a skull. "Whose wormy skull is that?" he asked the gravediggers. "That's Yorick, your dad's old jester from years ago when you were a baby." Well, as soon as the gravediggers said that, Hamlet screamed, "I knew him, Horatio," and jumped right into the grave and began speaking to the skull and asked it loads of questions like, "What should I do about everything?" and just, "Why?" And then he told it he really finally did need a wee. But by now Hamlet was so bad at making any decisions that he couldn't even decide whether he should get out of the wormy grave and go to the toilet or not. So he just stood there in the grave wailing at the skull and asking for its opinion. But then the gravediggers said they'd had enough and that he'd better not wee in the grave because they weren't actually finished digging it yet. So Hamlet said sorry and got out. That's when he saw his mum and Claudius. and Polonius' son Laertes was there too. And when he saw Hamlet, he said that he was going to batter him because of his dad and sister. Before Hamlet even had a chance to blink, Laertes jumped on him because Laertes was not like Hamlet. Laertes just did things and didn't really think about them first. But Laertes probably should have thought about it a bit because he jumped on Hamlet so hard that they both ended up in the grave, covered in worms, and Hamlet even weed himself a bit. Laertes jumped out of the grave because he didn't want to get wee on his new trousers, and then he challenged Hamlet to a sword fight back at the castle once Hamlet had got changed. Claudius loved the idea of a sword fight because he wanted Hamlet dead. So he told Laertes to cover his sword with poison because he was obsessed with killing people with poison. And he even had a poisoned glass of wine ready to give to Hamlet in case the sword didn't work. As soon as Hamlet had changed his trousers, Claudius gave him a rubbish sword and told him good luck. There was a huge crowd waiting, and some of them were pointing at Hamlet because he was wearing pyjama bottoms, since that's all he'd been able to find at the castle because someone, probably Claudius, had chucked all his trousers out. Hamlet looked up at his mum, and she waved loads and shouted down that she loved him and that she hoped he would win. But then Claudius kissed her on the lips for ages so that she would stop saying nice things to Hamlet because he didn't like it. Hamlet tried to tell Laertes that he hadn't actually meant to stab his dad through a curtain, that it had been a bit of an accident. But Laertes was too angry to listen. He swung his sword and cut Hamlet's finger. So Hamlet fought back as hard as he could with the rubbish sword, and he did so well that Laertes tripped and sliced his leg with his own sword. Gertrude got a bit excited that her son was doing so well, so she picked up the glass Claudius had meant for Hamlet and said, "Cheers to my son." "No!" shouted Claudius. But it was too late. Hamlet's mum gulped down the whole glass because fizzy wine was her favourite, and she hadn't had any since Christmas. Just then Hamlet realised that the cut on his finger was burning, and that the burning was spreading up his arm and into his chest. He looked at the cut on Laertes' leg and saw that he was in serious pain too. Then Laertes fell dramatically to the ground and cried, "The king is a poison murderer!" Then Hamlet's mum clutched her throat and toppled off her throne into the buffet. And that's when Hamlet realised that they were all poisoned and that it was all Claudius's fault. So that's when eventually Hamlet decided to avenge his ghost dad's murder, and he poison-stabbed Claudius. And then Hamlet died too. But then he opened his eyes and said, "Horatio, will you tell the story of me, what happened to me forever, even if it makes you cry?" And Horatio said that he would. And then Hamlet died again. But then he opened his eyes again and said, "Horatio, do you think I would have been a good hairdresser?" And Horatio said that he thought he would have been, even though he didn't really mean it because his hair was still longer on one side than it was on the other from when he'd let Hamlet cut it. But that wasn't the time to bring it up. And then Hamlet died again. But he kept opening his eyes and saying more things because even when he was almost dead, Hamlet could not stop talking and saying one more thing, and it went on like that for about 45 minutes. Once Hamlet was definitely dead, the Prince of Norway, who was called Fortinbras, came to be the king. And he let Horatio and loads of homeless people live in the palace too, because he was a really nice person. And even though Horatio never saw the ghost of Hamlet or Hamlet's dad again, he always made lasagna on a Thursday, and he left 2 bowls in the spooky bit of the castle before he went to bed. When I finished the story, Jodie looked at Zach and said, "Zach, do you want to end up like Hamlet?" And Zach's eyes went really wide, and then he said he was definitely going to be the Hat, and that he definitely wanted pepperoni on his pizza, and also that he was going to decide everything from now on. So I said, "Great, what film do you want to watch later then?" And Zach didn't say anything, and then he said he needed to go to the toilet, and we all knew it was because he couldn't decide. And we all burst out laughing and couldn't stop, especially when Maisie squealed, "To wee or not to wee, Zach? That is the question." And that's the end of the story of Hamlet. I've got a number of questions for you. Once again, if you pause after each one. First question, what is a synopsis? I did a synopsis at the beginning of part 2. What is a synopsis? In this retelling, Hamlet says, "To we or not to we?" That is the question. Do you know what the real quote is from Shakespeare? What Hamlet actually says? What he means by what he says is that he's questioning whether it is worth living or not. Why do you think Hamlet's mum, Gertrude, wouldn't listen to Hamlet when he tried to tell her what Claudius had done? Hamlet thinks Claudius is hiding behind the curtain, spying on him, so he stabs him. What does he actually stab? Hamlet feels really bad about this. What does he say he thought was behind the curtain? What does Ophelia do when she finds out her dad is dead? Hamlet goes into the grave and finds a skull. Whose skull is it? And what did he used to do? What was his job? How was Laertes, Ophelia's brother, not like Hamlet? Why did Claudius love the idea of a sword fight between Hamlet and Laertes? What poison is used this time and where? At the start of the sword fight, how did Claudius stop Hamlet's mum shouting nice things to Hamlet? How did the poison plan backfire on Claudius? What did Horatio do every Thursday night after the death of Hamlet? Does Hamlet avenge his dad's death? This is called a tragedy, this type of story, as awful things happen to the people in it. Shakespeare actually wrote 10 tragedies. It's a tough question to finish. How many people die in this story, and can you name them all? Well done, and thank you for listening.